In this screencast, we are going to talk about just basically an introduction to the proteins and their structures. So, proteins are extremely large natural polymers of amino acids. So, these are large natural polymers of amino acids. As you can see here, I've listed some of the proteins, some common proteins that we have, and you can look at their molecular weights here, and you can see that they are very large in molecular weight. So if we compare these to, for example, glucose, which we looked at in the carbohydrate chapter, that molecular weight is approximately 180 grams per mole. And you can see here that these molecular weights are in the thousands and can even go up to several million units. Now, the huge size of proteins, right, make them too large to pass through cell membranes. So these are too large to pass through cell membranes on their own. Right? And so that means that they are contained inside the normal cells where they are formed. However, if cells become damaged by disease or trauma, the protein contents leak out of those cells. And so that means that that's something that we can test as scientists to make sure that people's bodies are working correctly. So, for example, if you have excessive amounts of proteins in the urine, that's indicative of damaged kidney cells. If you know somebody who's had a heart attack, that can be confirmed by the presence in the blood of certain proteins, specifically enzymes, that are normally confined to the cells in the heart. So those cells in the heart have gotten damaged and those have leaked out, and we can measure them. Human cells contain about 9,000 proteins. And the body overall contains, and the human body contains over 100,000 different proteins. Now, the acid-base property. So let me start over. So another property that we're going to talk about in this screencast are the acid properties of proteins. And it's important to understand that proteins are zwitterions. Okay. And so the 20 different R groups of amino acids are really important factors in determining the physical and chemical properties of proteins. And as we talked about with zwitterions, the pH that proteins are at can change their structure. So proteins also have a characteristic isoelectric point, and they can also behave as buffers in solution. So they have a characteristic isoelectric point and can behave as buffers in solution. Now, they can be in solution or form stable colloidal dispersions, which is honestly what we most see. And it really depends on the repulsive force acting between the molecules with charges on their surface. Proteins tend to clump together and precipitate from solutions when the pH is equal to or close to the isoelectric point. Now, proteins have lots of different biological functions. And so we are going to think and list these biological functions that they have. The first one is catalytic function. Now, nearly all reactions that take place in living organisms are catalyzed by proteins functioning as enzymes. So, nearly all reactions that take place in living organisms are catalyzed by proteins functioning as enzymes. So now, without these catalytic proteins, biological reactions would take place just too slowly to support life. So enzyme catalyzed reactions range from relatively simple processes to processes that are very complex, like the duplication of hereditary material in a cell nuclei, which we will talk about. Enzymes get their own chapter. That's how important they are. So we're going to talk about them in the next chapter really in detail. Now, another function of proteins is that they are structural components. So we saw in chapter 17 that the main structural material for plants is cellulose. In the animal kingdom, structural materials other than inorganic compounds of like the skeleton are composed of protein. So these are, right, so in the animal kingdom, I'm going to say many structural components are proteins. And so, for example, collagen is a fiber-like protein that's responsible for the mechanical strength of skin and bone. Keratin is a chief constituent of hair, skin, and fingernails, is another example of a structural protein. They also are provide a way to store small molecules or ions. So, for example, casein is a milk protein, are stored forms of protein intended to nourish animals. Ferritin, which is found in all cells of the body, attaches to iron ions and forms a storage complex in humans and other animals. So, for example, ferritin is the storage protein for iron. Proteins also have a protective function, and specifically with antibodies. So we have antibodies that are proteins, and these protect the body from disease. They're really highly specific proteins that will destroy viruses or bacteria or other foreign substances that get into blood or tissue of the body. Blood clotting is another protective function. and it's carried out by the proteins thrombin and fibrogen. So blood clotting, so those proteins are thrombin. Right? So without those proteins, really small wounds would result in life-threatening bleeding. So they protect our bodies. Another function of proteins is regulatory. So hormones are proteins. So there's lots of body processes that are regulated by hormones. Right? And we've talked about different types of hormones, but many proteins are hormones. So growth hormone is an example of that. They also participate in nerve impulse transmissions. So some proteins behave as receptors. Of small molecules. That pass between gaps, right, which are called synapses, separating nerve cells. So rhodopsin is a protein that's found in the rod cells of the retina of the eye, and it functions in that way to help us process our vision, which is, I think, is really interesting. So an example of this is rhodopsin, right, which helps us process vision. Then there's a movement function for proteins. So every time we climb stairs, push a button, blink an eye, any of that, we use muscles, right? And those have proteins as their major components. The proteins actin and myosin are particularly important in the process involving movement. They're long filament proteins that slide along each other during muscle contraction. So for example, we've got actin and myosin, right? And they are part of that smooth muscle contraction. And then there's a transport function. Lots of small ions and molecules are transported through the body after binding to proteins. Right? So, for example, fatty acids are carried between fat, which is adipose tissue, and other tissues or organs by serum albumin, which is a blood protein. Hemoglobin is a really well-known example. It carries oxygen from the lungs to other body tissues. And transferrin transfers iron in blood plasma. So lots and lots of different functions that proteins do. Now, we can classify proteins in two ways. We can classify them based on their shape. So some of our proteins are what we classify as fibrous, and some are globular. Now, fibrous proteins are made up of long rod shape or string-like molecules that intertwine to form fibers. Right? So examples of this are things like collagen, right, and keratin. Okay. Then you can have globular proteins. These are more spherical and either dissolve in water or form stable suspensions in water. So these are spherical and either dissolve in water or form suspensions in water. And they aren't typically found in structural tissue, but are transport proteins. So globular proteins are your transport proteins, right? And enzymes. Right? And so what we find with these particular globular proteins is they have a hydrophobic region that's all inside here, and then they have an aqueous region that's all of these kind of charged functional groups that are pointing out, and these all can of course interact with water. And so that kind of forces them into a sphere with their hydrophobic and hydrophilic structure. Now, another classification scheme for proteins is based on composition. Proteins are either simple or conjugated. Now, simple proteins are those that contain only amino acid residues. So these are made up of only amino acid residues, right? And then conjugated proteins contain amino acid residues and either organic or inorganic components. So these have amino acid residues and either organic or inorganic components. Okay. Now, the non-amino acid part of the conjugated proteins are called prosthetic groups. So these are just the non-amino acid components or the parts of proteins. They can be a lot of things. So proteins can contain lipids, they can contain carbohydrates, they can contain metal ions. And so one of the really common ones is a heme group here, and it contains the iron here. And so iron-containing proteins that we talked about, like hemoglobin, are called metalloproteins because they have this metallic heme group. So there's the metal, there's the heme, that's distributed here through the protein. Now, I wanted to take a moment and I want to point out that this is a way that we are going to look at proteins. Okay, and that's shown with ribbon structures. And you're going to see that these chains are named, and we are going to talk about this more in our next screencast, but I did want to point this out, so in case you're like, what are those wild colors and why are there ribbons? This is a protein structure. This is how we show, for example, hemoglobin. So that's the hemoglobin protein structure. Now, I like this table, and this is what we're going to end this screencast on, is looking at these prosthetic groups. So there are different classes here. And so, for example, if you have a metalloprotein, it's going to contain some sort of metal. And so iron and zinc are really common ones. You have hemoproteins. They contain that heme group on the previous slide. You can have phosphoproteins. They'll contain an extra phosphate group. You can have glycoproteins. Those are going to contain carbohydrates. Lipoproteins will have lipids mixed in some way. And then nucleoproteins will have some nucleic acids, DNA or RNA. And those are specifically found in viruses. So we have lots of different conjugated proteins out there that have these prosthetic groups. In the next screencast, we are going to talk more about protein structure. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to stop by my office.